Good evening. My name is Larry Krause, and during this presentation I'm going to highlight two historical terrorist events that occurred in the 1970s from an emergency management perspective. The first attack occurred during the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, where members of Black September, a Palestinian terrorist organization, were able to take 9 Israeli athletes hostage inside the Olympic Village. Later, in 1976, a similar incident occurred when members of the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine and members of the revolutionary cells of Germany were able to hijack Air France Flight 139 en route to Paris from Tel Aviv. The plane had 242 passengers and 12 crew members. This event would later be known as Operation Entebbe. As we explain some of the similarities, differences, and challenges in both of these responses, we're going to see a vast difference in how both of these incidents ended. In part, this is where planning, preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery are very important, as well as leadership. Let's go back to Munich. September 5th, 1972, members of Black September, dressed in tracksuits, disguised as athletes, were able to enter the compound by scaling a 6-foot fence. Shortly after they entered the compound, they were able to locate the Israeli delegation in 2 different apartments. Upon entry to these apartments, 2 of the Israeli delegation members were killed. 9 were taken hostage. One of the Israeli delegation members were drugged into a common area, which would later trigger a police response. A roving patrol came across the body and then realized that a hostage situation was taking place when he discovered men with guns and several other individuals inside the apartment. Upon this notification, Munich police notified their chief of police, Manfred Schreiber, who would later be the sole commander of this scene. During negotiations with Black September, Chief Schreiber was able to open up lines of rapport. Once he received the demands from Black September, which was the release of over 234 prisoners from both Israeli and German prisons, he began negotiations. One of the key issues was that the Israeli government was not willing to negotiate with terrorists. Therefore, Chief Schreiber had to buy some time in order to launch a rescue attempt. In launching this attempt, he was missing one key piece of intelligence. Schreiber wanted to know how many terrorists were located inside the apartments. This would give him the opportunity to put officers in place in order to attempt the rescue. While negotiating, he was able to extend the deadlines 3 different times, saying he needed more time to negotiate the release of the prisoners. This worked in his favor to a certain extent. He's also able to talk the leader of Black September, who identified himself as Isa, to allow an Olympic official to come in and check on the hostages as goodwill. Once the Olympic official checked on the hostages, he was able to ascertain that there was 5 terrorists inside the apartment. This was the key piece of intelligence that Schreiber needed in order to launch the response. During the initial response, there were several media personnel live streaming officers getting into their positions in order to take down the terrorists. Once the terrorists were able to see this live stream on TV, they realized quickly that their demands were not going to be met. Therefore, they made a second set of demands. The second set of demands was to have the hostages and the terrorists moved to an airport nearby via helicopter and have an airliner fueled and ready to go to Cairo, Egypt. The chief of police agreed. However, he knew that he could never let the terrorists leave Germany. Therefore, he came up with a plan to have armed police officers disguised as the crew, in addition to 5 snipers strategically placed around the airport. During the planning phase, several members of the crew decided they were going to abandon their post, saying that this was a suicide mission. Therefore, it left the plane empty. This would be a key piece of information that would cause the breakdown in this overall plan. In addition, the 5 snipers that were deployed around the airport were ill-equipped, without proper optics, and not trained in actually being a sniper. They were regular street patrol guys given long rifles in order to take the shot to take these snipers out. The next key failure in this response was the helicopter pilots were ordered to land in a certain position in order to provide a line of sight for the snipers. However, upon landing, the helicopter pilots landed the wrong way, taking out several of the snipers' advantage, therefore only leaving 2 snipers out of the 5 with a proper shot sight picture. During this time, more things went wrong. The initial piece of intelligence that Schraber was waiting for would be the very intelligence that would hurt him in the long run. The amount of terrorists now went from 5 to 8. Therefore, there was not enough sniper cover to cover each and every terrorist. However, they still went forward with the plan. The terrorist attempted to take a shot and missed. Once the terrorists entered the cockpit or entered the plane and realized no one was there, they knew it was a trap. Therefore, the chain of events broke down, causing the terrorists to kill all the hostages. In the end, three terrorists were left alive. Issa, the leader, his deputy, and several other terrorists were killed during the attack. The last little piece of information that's very important as far as response and communication is, once it was all said and done and all the hostages were dead, the media broadcasted that this was a successful rescue attempt, which rescued every single hostage and they were alive. This was broadcasted across German media. However, later on they had to broadcast that this was a failure and all the hostages were dead. Let's move on and we'll come back and talk about some of the response issues and communication issues as far as Munich goes. But let's move on to Entebbe, a completely different situation altogether as far as planning and response. Operation Entebbe, once the airplane was hijacked, it took a brief stop in Libya to refuel. Once back on course, it ended up landing in Entebbe Airport in Uganda. Some challenges. One, they were joined by more terrorists. So the 4 terrorists expanded to about 8 or 10. Second, the terrorists were being supported by the Ugandan government, which provided more air support. Once Israel and the IDF and the Air Force got wind of what was going on as far as the hijacking of the Israeli plane, or which predominantly Israeli passengers, they started planning unofficially. Yoni Netanyahu was one of the commanders who started planning with a special forces group from IDF, along with the Air Force commander. They quickly realized that they had to identify in their arsenal what fleet could actually make the 2,000-mile trek from Israel to Uganda, highlighting that the Hercules C-130 would be the only plane for them to use to travel that far. Also, they went back and forth in planning on whether they would use a small force or a large force. In the end, they came up with using a small contingent force, and they were going to disguise themselves as the Ugandan presidential convoy in order to get close to the airport and take out the terrorists. This planning went back and forth for several days. So from June 27th, 1976, from the Air France hijacking, the day it hijacked, to July 4th, 1976, nearly 6 days later, they had already planned, conducted dry runs, and practiced several communication methods in order to carry out this attack. The whole mission was to take 60 minutes, from start to finish. From when the first C-130 landed, from when the additional C-130s landed, it was going to take 60 minutes. Planning continued throughout the days until they got official approval. The official approval was only approved about an hour outside of drop time. They were already en route to Entebbe Airport, dealing with multiple situations in the air. The first of which was how many Ugandan authorities would be there when they got there. Once intelligence started pouring in, one of the key factors in this was when the terrorists released several of the hostages that were not of Israeli descent. Therefore, they separated them. The segregation of the Israeli passengers left about 94 plus the crew, because the crew failed to leave. They said they were staying until everybody was released. Once all the other passengers were released, intelligence started pouring in, which allowed the IDF to plan in transit. They changed their way of planning in order to fit what was going on in the current intelligence. Intelligence continued all the way up to the operation. Once they were done and decided to go and got the go-ahead from the Israeli government, Yoni Netanyahu was going to run the IDF group, and another commander was going to run the Air Force group. Two different groups planned this attack from start to finish. Very detailed. On July 4th, 1976, they boarded 4 Hercules C-130s and went to Entebbe, Uganda. They had practiced for night runs because they thought the runway would be dark. However, upon arrival, the runway was still lit. They were able to land, exit the convoy, pull up to the checkpoint, take out the 2 terrorists, enter the building, take out the additional terrorists, and rescue over 104 hostages with only 1 casualty. The 1 casualty was Yoni Netanyahu, the commander. The amount of communication planning between these events was drastically different. The one thing during Munich was that the Munich police were able to, they knew that there was more terrorists 30 minutes prior to continuing the operation at the airport, and they still went ahead and attempted to do the rescue. What they could have done is scaled down the rescue attempt and continued to negotiate with the hostages after he had built the rapport. The communication here was critical in response. 1, here's the differences between communication as far as Entebbe and Munich. The commanders listened during the IDF response to all the intelligence that came in and adjusted up to go time on how they were going to handle the entry of these teams. However, in Munich, they failed to do so. Another key thing when we talk about communication strategies. The one communication strategy that failed in Munich was the fact that they allowed multiple media sources still to remain on scene during the Olympic attack without vacating them, getting them out of the area, setting up a perimeter. What led to the success of Entebbe was there was a communication restriction on Entebbe. Yoni Netanyahu locked the base down and took away communication access to all his troops. They wanted complete silence on the lines for this attack. They wanted to go in silent and leave silently. The only time during Entebbe where people knew about the results is after the fact that it happened, and it was leaked to the media on their way back. However, Munich wasn't so lucky. Both these events had drastically different outcomes. Entebbe went down as one of the largest and most successful hostage rescues in history. Munich was a drastic failure due to the inability and experience of all the members involved. From the chief down to the ground members, there was an inexperience in response. In Entebbe, there was an extreme amount of experience, extreme amount of discipline, and an extreme amount of leadership that went into the response mechanism, which ultimately led to the success. In future events, Munich and Entebbe should be studied by all responders to show how leadership can be the difference between success and failure.